are these people?
So I so in light of Joe requesting to talk about Palestine a little bit, and in light of Jamila Jayapal's backtracking on what she said regarding Israel, which she was actually correct. For one, well, we don't give anyone in the squad or the progressives much credit, but when they do, we do want to be fair and kind of give credit where credit's due, that she was actually right in this case. But obviously, given how our government is so in the hand of the Israel lobby, that she probably was told to backtrack what she was saying. But I think in light of all of this, there is, I think, a deeper conversation that is not necessarily being discussed. And Joe, I kind of call you, or somewhat of a historian, so I'm sure you can add a little bit to what we'll probably discuss. But we do have some Kwame in this as well. We have not mentioned him in a while, yes. But he had some things to say regarding this conflict that I do think is important, that I think it should also reflect, if we look at history, the significance of this conflict. So this is how we'll start. So Democracy Now! Actually did a clip on this. This was pulled yesterday.
This is Democracy Now!
Sorry. Yeah. So Amy Goodman interviews Noura Erakat, who is a Palestinian attorney. So she talked to her regarding the issues happening within Israel-Palestine right now, and then obviously Jamila Jayapal's comments. So this is about 10 minutes. So we'll watch it through, and then we can talk about it after that, and then we'll go a little deeper. So.
DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
President Biden's meeting Israeli President Isaac Herzog at the White House today. On Wednesday, Herzog will address a joint session of Congress, though several progressive Democrats have announced plans to boycott his speech. The group includes Congress members Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, Ilhan Omar, and Jamal Bowman. Cori Bush wrote, the Israeli government's responsible for enforcing an apartheid state and rampantly abusing the rights of Palestinians. Congress should not be giving a platform to the president of a country that shows no respect for human rights. I will not be attending his joint address, unquote. On Monday, President Biden spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and invited him for a meeting in the United States this year. Biden recently criticized the makeup of Netanyahu's far-right cabinet, describing it as, quote, one of the most extremist he's ever seen in Israel. Israeli President Herzog's visit to the White House comes just weeks after the Israeli military attacked the Jenin refugee camp, killing at least 12 Palestinians in Israel's largest military operation in the occupied West Bank in 20 years. We begin today's show with Noura Erakat. She's a Palestinian human rights attorney and associate professor at Rutgers University. She's author of Justice for Some, Law on the Question of Palestine. Let's begin with Herzog's visit, the Israeli president to Biden, the address, joint session of Congress, and then yesterday, President Biden speaking personally on the phone with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, inviting him to the United States. Your response, Noura Erakat.
So let's just begin by setting up the context that this is 2023 in the aftermath of the legacy human rights organizations, Israeli human rights organizations, UN committees, UN agencies, as well as multiple scholars and independent investigations have all concluded that Israel oversees an apartheid regime. This is also in a context where, since the collapse of the peace process in 2000, Israel has made clear that there will be no Palestinian state. There will be no such thing as binationalism, that they will catalyze and enhance their takeover of Palestinian lands and their removal. They have shifted from occupation to warfare. This is a completely different universe than the one existed in 2000. And yet the rhetoric and the feedback surrounding Isaac Herzog's invitation and speech is one that completely ignores all of that. So it's important to emphasize that this effort within Congress, specifically among a mainstream Democratic element, is meant to normalize apartheid. It's not just saying that they want to defend Israel. They are saying that if this is in fact apartheid, as all of these luminaries and experts have concluded, then in this case, it's okay, it should be an exception, and it should be exemplary for others to follow. And so I applaud the progressive members of Congress who are skipping this address. I encourage other members of Congress to do the same and continue to build the momentum amongst a progressive base that sees Palestine squarely within a social justice agenda. This is already manifest in social justice movements, such as Black Palestinian Transnational Solidarity, that has centered that this is a joint struggle, that has endorsed BDS, and that in fact catapulted many of these progressive Democrats into office. This is also evident amongst the Democrats themselves. Not only has Israel become a bipartisan issue, but for the first time ever, more Democrats sympathize with Palestinians than they do with Israelis, according to a 2023 Gallup poll. Continue to build that momentum, resist this movement to normalize apartheid. What the members of Congress are doing with the invitation, what they did in response to Representative Jayapal's very accurate statements that Israel is a racist state, is akin to gaslighting, for lack of a better word, but really is normalization that is responding to the fact that they have lost the battle on the grassroots level and are trying to stem from the top down what they couldn't defeat from the bottom up. And we see this not only in this normalization, but we also see it in the passage of anti-BDS resolutions, as well as the adoption of the Israel Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition that wants to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
Noura, I wanted to play the clip you were just referring to the Progressive Caucus chair, Congressmember Pramila Jayapal, who made headlines this weekend after she called Israel a racist state while speaking at the Netroots Nation conference in Chicago Saturday.
I want you to know that we have been fighting to make it clear that Israel is a racist state, that the Palestinian people deserve self-determination and autonomy, that the dream of a two-state solution is slipping away from us.
After facing criticism, Congressmember Jayapal later clarified her comments, writing, quote, "I do not believe the idea of Israel as a nation is racist. I do, however, believe that Netanyahu's extreme right-wing government has engaged in discriminatory and outright racist policies, and that there are extreme racists driving that policy within the leadership of the current government. We know that the status quo is unacceptable, untenable, and unjust," Pramila Jayapal said. Your response to that, Noura Erakat?
One, I want to point out that nothing that she said was controversial. If Representative Jayapal is wrong, then so are all the experts and the advocates that study this issue and that apply it across the globe. So the attack on her is actually a bullying and harassment attack that is meant to scare everyone else from even having a conversation and acknowledging this reality on the ground, and most importantly, taking responsibility for it. The United States is not just a bystander here. The United States is complicit and a pillar of Israeli apartheid in its provision on unequivocal financial, diplomatic, and military support. But for that support, Israel could not sustain this regime, which is not surprising. Which is not surprising at all, because the U.S. was the last pillar to fall, the last domino to fall in sustaining apartheid in South Africa, where it had to fall in line with everyone else. But during apartheid South Africa and the international campaign against it during that regime's tenure, the United States issued the most vetoes within the Security Council to protect apartheid there, just to protect apartheid in Namibia and South Africa. And here we're seeing a similar pattern. As to the way that Representative Jayapal amended her statement, note that she didn't walk it back. She didn't say that Israel is a racist state. She wanted to make a distinction between Israeli people and the Israeli government. But what we need to understand here, and this is important for the audience to know, that she used the term Israeli nation. And there is no such thing as an Israeli national within Israel's law. And this is the crux of the matter. Israel bifurcates Jewish nationality from Israeli citizens so that it can flow all of the possessory rights to land, to employment, to housing, to the right to life through Jewish nationality in a way that it's extraterritorialized, so that a pubescent Jewish teen who doesn't even know where Israel is on the map ostensibly has more claims than a Palestinian grandma who is 80 years old, who was born before the state of Israel was established in 1948, has to those rights. Under any situation, we would decry the system as being discriminatory, contravening liberal norms of democracy. But in this situation, the international community, specifically the United States and Western governments, want to insist that this exception is acceptable and exemplary. And what I want to emphasize is that it actually is not just harmful to Palestinians, as evidenced by the systematic killing of Palestinians, the removal and the harm inflicted upon them, but that these ideas are not contained just to Israel, Palestine, but in fact are exported. These ideas of what sovereignty should look like are exported across the world. We see it embodied by the Hindutva movement in India and its reigning government. We also see it embodied even in the United States by European supremacists such as Richard Spencer, who says that he envisions that the future of European sovereignty should be modeled upon Israel's model of sovereignty. These ideas are dangerous. And it's not that we want to make an exception here. We want to actually make it clear that there should be no situation where states are not states that belong to everybody who is there, and rather than to a nationality that exists extraterritorially.
And Noura Erakat, I wanted to ask you, the President Biden's announcement that he has invited Prime Minister Netanyahu to also to visit the United States after months of saying that he had no plans to do so, especially in light of the enormous settlement expansion that the Netanyahu government has been involved in. I think the watchdog group Peace Now has said that 12,800 settlements across the West Bank been established since January by the Netanyahu government. Your response to this, the Biden presidency just saying, well, we're inviting Netanyahu to come to the U.S. again.
Listen, the 13,000 some settlements are just the tip of the iceberg. Israel has actually transferred authority of the West Bank from military supervision to civilian oversight. They've basically taken the fig leaf off, that this is not a temporary situation, but that this is a permanent condition, and they're planning for annexation. This contravenes the diplomatic consensus on a two-state solution, which is fraught on its own. But even more than that, this contravenes even the U.S. and this U.S. administration, specifically the Biden administration. They didn't want to invite Netanyahu, not just because of his contravention and violations against Palestinians. I think that would be quite ambitious on our part. But in fact, it was Netanyahu who undermined a sitting president in trying to establish Iranian rapprochement. It was Netanyahu who came to Congress to address a joint session to actually torpedo President Obama's attempt to establish an Iran nuclear agreement and received several standing ovations. This is the Biden administration's legacy. So the fact that not only has this been overturned, but now they're going to invite Netanyahu nevertheless without stepping back any of those missteps, any of that betrayal, is an about face and says a lot about the Democratic administration and where Israel fits, where as far as the United States is concerned, they've thrown up their hands that they will continue to provide unequivocal support and place absolutely no conditions on Israel's behavior, on Israel's participation, even in furtherance of the U.S.'s national interests in the region.
Yep. Well, I wanted to mention before we get started, do you know Joe Low Key by chance? Rapper extraordinaire, you muted. There you go.
I mean, I'm familiar with the name, yes.
You know, she talked about the extent that Israel has ties everywhere. He's been censored on Spotify, as well as other Palestinian pro-Palestinian artists, which to me is wild that Israel has that much power to pull them completely from a platform in some cases,
Right.
or be otherwise censored. But yeah, I just want to say that that's
Okay.
happening.
There, fellas, and everyone watching right now, there's so much to unpack here. There's so much to unpack here. And the lawyer, I did get a chance to watch this earlier today, and amidst all of my errands and everything else I had going on, I did watch a little bit of French 24 earlier today, and I saw the Israeli president addressing Congress today. And my first thought was, why? Why is the president of another country allowed to address the United States and openly discuss their country's foreign policy with another country? And it has nothing to do with diplomacy. This isn't a situation where, for example, Anthony Blinken is going to China in the name of diplomacy. It's not that. This seems like it's considerably more than just diplomacy. It's not. In fact, it's not even diplomacy. It's realistically, it's racist propaganda. That's what this is. It's racist propaganda. And the attorney said that the Biden administration, it gives cover to the Netanyahu presidency and the right-wing government of Israel. None of that should be surprising to anybody, because the Biden administration is a fraudulent administration. The Biden administration is a racist administration. Joe Biden, and I've said this on Twitter months ago, Joe Biden is almost single-handedly responsible for every adverse social condition in the United States that most Americans live under right now. And if you
Come on, man.
Huh?
Come on, man.
That's our soundboard. So you're gonna hear. So just be.
I missed that. I missed that. If you look at Joe Biden's history and many of his policies, they are anti-Black and they're completely racist. I mean, we could do an entire show just about Joe Biden's legislation that he wrote basically from 1984 up until the Rave Act, which was 2003.
Yep.
19 years. And he did a lot of damage to this country. So it's no surprise that a man whose career was built on racism is willing to support a prime minister and a prime minister's government that is wholly built on racism. And the racism in this instance is the continued persecution of Palestinians. And if you look at there's obvious parallels with the Palestinians in the Middle East, and quite frankly, Black people in the United States. There's obvious parallels, because if you look at the civil rights movement, Black people were being killed ad nauseum by a white power structure. Take a look at what happened with everything in the summer of 2020, similar situation. Take a look at the land and the homes and the property that is being taken by an Israeli government from Palestinians. How is that any different than what happened with the enslavement of Africans from the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865 up and through redlining and blockbusting in the 50s, 60s, and 40s in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in the United States? Similar situation. The only difference is the land that was taken from the Palestinians was taken by force. The land and the property that was taken away from Black people by a white power structure was legalized. It was legalized. And by the way, redlining began in my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland in 1910. Yes, that happened. So I'm saying all of this because, and I've said this, Collin, this is something you and I have spoken about on several occasions. We have to continue to internationalize the struggle. And the best way, quite frankly, to internationalize the struggle and for Black people to have any sort of humanity, freedom, equality, and survival in the United States is to align the struggle for Black liberation with the struggle for Palestinian liberation against an Israeli power structure, because the parallels are glaringly obvious. There have been several times where I've attended rallies and protests that are pro-Palestine, and there have been plenty of times during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2000 and 2001 where there are plenty of Palestinian brothers and sisters marching along Black people and other people of color that were in support of Black people, that were against police violence, police-sanctioned violence against Black people in the United States. And the police-sanctioned violence against Black people in the United States is no different than the police-sanctioned violence from the Israeli police departments and Israeli police power structure against Palestinians. So the lawyers said that we need to sympathize, that Americans are becoming more sympathetic towards the plight of Palestinians. We are far past the point of being sympathetic, way past the point. Sympathy is inappropriate at this point. There needs to be action. And the appropriate course of action for a racist right-wing government that continues to persecute past Palestinians must be the similar action that was taken against P.W. Botha's government in South Africa. Boycott, divest, sanction. It's as simple as that. Look at what happened with all of the Russian oligarchs. They were boycotted, divested, and sanctioned, and none of them have their wealth anymore. A similar situation must take place against the right-wing Israeli government. And we need more support from members of government, or including just the quote-unquote squad. And we all have our issues with the squad. But I fully applaud each of them for taking a stand and standing up for what is right, at least in this instance, because there's no way that a government like the Israeli government should be addressing the United States, quite frankly, about anything, especially when you have lobbying organizations like AIPAC that fund both House and the Senate, Democrat and Republican. Yep. So if the Congress has anything or any sort of integrity about themselves, they will stop accepting funds from from AIPAC, and they'll continue to move forward with fighting for the liberation of Palestinians. And this can't, and everyone talks about a two-state solution. Palestinians were there first. If anything, the Israeli right-wing government that stole the land from the Palestinians, they're the ones that should probably take a look at moving somewhere else.
Be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
You know, the Nakba has been incredibly horrific, in my opinion. They've poisoned water supplies of Palestinians. They've, straight up murdered and killed multiple, journalists at this point. They've, you name it. The Palestinian kids, as a pastime, put their friends on stretchers and run through the streets. Like, it's long since, if you're not sympathetic by now, something's wrong with you, So
you see, that's in Reef, and therein lies the issue. It can't just be about sympathy.
Yep.
It can't just be about empathy. Now, granted, those emotions and those feelings are important because feelings make us human beings. Feelings define who we are as Homo sapiens, as people. But after a while, feelings only go so far. Action is what's needed. Action is what's needed. And it's the type of action that goes past just saying, oh, wow, I hope everything goes okay with those Palestinians. All right. It has to be more than that. Because quite frankly, 100 years ago, there were a whole lot of people that felt sympathy, or 200 years ago, there were some white people that felt sympathy for Black people.
Yeah.
How did that work out? It can't just be about sympathy. It has to be about action. There's two keys that unlock that door. Yes, you need the emotion to feel and understand what other people who are oppressed are feeling. But then there has to be action to end the oppression and the suffering of the people.
And I've heard that before, Collin. Where'd I hear that before from? This guy might have said some stuff.
This guy definitely said some stuff, and but to kind of add on to what you were saying, Joe, I think a lot, because we hear about Israel and Palestine all the time, but often I think what we don't often talk about is the history, and I feel most people aren't fully aware of the history that is tied to Israel and Palestine, especially in terms of the geopolitics around the turn of the last century. Now, this is very short. This is about a minute, but Kwame Ture, this was done, I think he spoke of this in 1990 in Minnesota. So here he's talking about Zion. Yeah. So here he's talking about Zionism, which let's not get it twisted. Like, this whole issue with Israel and Palestine is not in terms of people being anti-Semitic and all that kind of stuff. And I wish if Jai Paul had any balls, she would actually say this is a Zionist occupation. So let's make that distinction right now. We're not saying anything regarding like Israelis/Palestinians in particular. What we're talking about is Zionism, which is a whole nother can of worms that no one actually talks about. So, but I think Kwame does a good job of kind of explaining the significance of Zionism here. And then there's a little bit more that I want to add to this. So go ahead, Reef.
That great man, V.I. Lenin, at the turn of the century, wrote a book entitled Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Is it? Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism? Yes. If one would read this little pamphlet, one would see here that Mr. Lenin had precisely pointed out that all of the world had already been conquered and divided by colonial powers. There was no else in the world left to be conquered or divided by colonial powers. This is the time when Zionism comes to rise. Zionism comes to look for a state when everywhere else in the world is already dominated. Thus, in order for Mr. Herzl to get a country for Zionists, what he did was to attach himself to imperialism. British imperialism in this case, quite specifically. Of course, as an African who suffered under the heels of British imperialism, I can have no love for it, and certainly I cannot love anyone who attaches themselves to it and attaches themselves to it for the foundation of a state and then call this a liberation movement. Liberation movements fight against imperialism, not with it. Clearly here. The legal foundation of the State of Israel is what is known as the Balfour Declaration. This declaration was issued in 1917. A man in the government of Britain named Balfour wrote a paper and promised the Jews a national home. The national home he promised them was an area which Britain was colonizing, Palestine. Palestine didn't belong to the British. Just like Ireland doesn't belong to the British, even though they have troops there. But here, these British imperialists signed a note and gave it to the Jews, and they accepted it. Where is the morality for this? If you say that Israel belongs to you, then you don't go to a thief to get Israel, you go and take it. Once you go to an immoral being such as British imperialism, and this is the basis for you getting the land, then clearly here those who are truly liberation fighters must question this. The basis, we say, is the Balfour Declaration, and Zionists know it. The Zionism is certainly not a liberation movement because it never fought against any imperialism. As a matter of fact, today, Zionism is the baby, child, and infant protector of imperialism in the Middle East. It carries out the interests of American imperialism. As a matter of fact, Zionism and American imperialism is like this. If our tax dollars would stop giving money to Israel, the state would sink tomorrow. And certainly no one can deny that American imperialism is the leading imperialist nation in the world. So we cannot see how a liberation movement is so tied, string and ham to American imperialism. They work hand in hand with American imperialism. Thus they can hardly be a liberation movement. In addition to this, Zionism has nothing to do with anything religion, nothing. All religions are concerned with human beings after they die. That's what religions are for. Islam will tell you what happens to you when you die. As a matter of fact, this which forces you to live a good life so that after death you'll be able to enjoy the rewards of heaven. The same is true for Judaism. But Zionism says nothing about the individual after they're dead. They don't give a damn about you. The Zionism has nothing to do with religion at all. And one should not make the confusion here. The Palestinian state belongs to the Palestinian people. This is a fact.
Let me add more to this to kind of give a little bit more context. So he talks about Theodor Herzl. He was the founder and president of the Zionist organization, I would say around just before the turn of the century. He died. So basically, he was the father of the Zionist movement, as we know now. He died in 1904, if I remember correctly. David Lloyd George, who became prime minister in the UK, around during the First World War. Now, prior to this time, Palestine was occupied by the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, right?
Right.
So by the time World War I came through, there was a transition from Palestine being belonging to the Ottomans to the British. So that was when they started making their move in 1917 to begin the process. Right. So this is when, so this was the process when, you know, the Zionist occupation basically collaborated with the British government to essentially make plans to capitalize on Israel being a state in 1948. Gotcha. Okay, so that's where we are now. But Quietere brought up a good point.
Yep.
If something belongs to you, it's yours. That's your birthright. You don't need to make an appeal to the devil in order to get something that is rightfully yours. So this is a key issue with Zionism, and this is a key of what people are not necessarily talking about in terms of this whole Israel-Palestine conflict. This is all tied to imperialism. So it's the idea of the Zionist occupation collaborated with the British government to essentially forcibly take land in the guise that this was their birthright. And essentially pushing out the Palestinian Arabs who were living there and continue to live there that they're trying to overtake their land. So as I said, it's the idea of if it belongs to you, you wouldn't have to take it by force that way. So, and that's what people are not necessarily discussing. And I think there's the history there that I think people do not necessarily understand, but it's the idea that there's a lot that is tied to the idea of, oh, you're anti-Semitic if you mention Israel in terms of being racist and all that kind of stuff. I would argue more accurately, it's probably more imperialist in its approach than maybe necessarily racist.
Correct.
But it's the idea that the Zionist occupation, you know, and not just Britain, basically the imperialist powers at the time, which included Germany and Russia, in addition to Turkey, were in collaboration with this in order to forcibly obtain this land. So, so I think just knowing that, and just especially in light of what Collin was saying, that's kind of what puts this in context. It's the idea of people going to the enemy to take something that they claim, given a religious standpoint, is theirs. So no one ever talks about it in that way. And I think that's where we need to start having those conversations. It's the idea of...
Where does bombing Syria come into their religion? Where does that? Where does, you know, I mean, that's now, we're funding that, by the way. I don't know if people know, but we send Israel thousands upon thousands of dollars of military aid, including their, what's that rocket system? One of those. One that keeps Iranian rockets from hitting them. Iron Dome, that's it.
Yeah, Iron Dome system that protects Israel from aerial attacks. And Reef, it's a lot more than just thousands. It's billions of dollars a year.
Yep.
I think it's $3.8 billion that's being sent by the United States government to Israel, just I think in defense. It's more than just thousands. It's thousands of thousands multiplied.
But
so it's a lot.
But you see, but in thinking about that, so basically the Zionist lobby back then, they pooled their money, their resources, and got into these channels to essentially convince the government to do this. And it probably wasn't a lot of them, but they would definitely had the financial and political capital at that time in order to do that. Could you imagine if Black people were able to pull our resources together, or people of color in general are able? Well, we're seeing this with BRICS right now. That's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I can.
They're beginning to realize, like we're beginning to see this happening now in terms of it doesn't take a whole lot necessarily to pull, especially if you're a person of color, to pull resources among your own together to actually make that kind of influence. You gotta understand, these were not that many people who were able to, but they literally changed history in terms of this. So if you can, so it doesn't take a whole lot necessarily. And this is kind of why I think you kind of wanted to talk about this in relation to, we're talking about labor rights right now. The idea that, you know, it seems impossible or I think individually or just a few of us in order to get something done, but look what it was able to happen. That like this, not even like this was over 100 years ago when this occurred.
Right.
So
well, they're still trying to do stuff based off a book that was written before then by people we don't know.
Right.
So, and that's us. This whole, especially from the right wing perspective of this, where they've given AIPAC and Israel itself down, like they literally want to bring about the end times by funding Israel. They hope Jesus is going to come back and, you know, start the rapture. So we have to control Israel, right? Or the Jews have to control Israel for that to happen. So, you know, that's part of it too.
So, yeah. So given that, and Joe, you mentioned, it's good for the squad or certain members of the squad to kind of stand against this. And I think in this case, yes.
Yeah, rotating
but
hero.
they've been kind of flaky. Right.
Yeah.
But they've been kind of flaky on this in the past. I think really the only one who has been ones who have been consistent with this is Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Obviously, Rashida Tlaib have been very consistent with this. So I think so. I give them credit in this case, but not too much, because I'm sure they were allowed to.
Joe Biden straight up
not
called himself a Zionist when he was in Israel. Like,
right.
I mean, you can't get more on the nose than that. So
right. So I can't give them much credit if they were allowed to do this. Otherwise,
yeah, it's not going to hurt them.
They would. It's not going to hurt them any in this case, especially since pretty much everyone in government, in both parties, are sold out for the Israeli lobby. So it's not, to me, it's just, I'm glad you did it, but they've been inconsistent with this, or they've been kind of silent on this issue.
They have power. They have real power. They can do stuff. We're just all sitting here talking about it. They've got the vote. They have power. Like, this is our issue with them, is that it's always strongly worded letters, if anything. So it's like Joe was talking about. Without action, y'all shit ain't shit. So
and
go ahead.
Yeah, and to bring up your point, Collin, you said something about 7 or 8 minutes ago. You said when Israel was created, it was only a few people that dramatically changed the course of history. That's what you said. A few people that dramatically changed the course of history. Think about the few people that could have dramatically changed the course of history if they would actually use their political power as they're supposed to, most notably the squad. Think of, Collin, one of the first times we met was January 3rd, 2020, for the Force the Votes rallies in Washington, D.C. It was me, you, and about 20 other people walking around the 3 buildings that make up the House of Representatives. We had picket signs, megaphones, cell phones, sourdough bread, and reasonably warm hot chocolate on that day. And we were marching around saying, hey, don't drop the ball, Medicare for all. Could you imagine how the summer of 2020 would have looked if the progressive members of the House, if the squad had done what they were supposed to do and not vote for Nancy Pelosi's speakership until a floor vote was offered on the floor of the House of Representatives for Medicare for all? Could you imagine what would have happened? And again, they didn't need every Democrat. They just needed a handful of people. And that handful, the squad, was unwilling to stand up against Pelosi. And conversely, look at what happened with the Freedom Caucus. The Freedom Caucus was a far right-wing section or a faction of the Republican Party. And they forced John Boehner, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, they forced him out of Washington, D.C. into a lobbying position somewhere, I think in the Midwest somewhere. They forced John Boehner, who is as Washington, D.C. insider as you could possibly be, and they forced him out. And again, it was only a few people.
You know why?
It was only a few people.
You know why they were capable of doing that? Because they threatened a third party. They threatened to leave the Republican Party. They were going to be the Tea Party. That is what they were doing. Like, they threatened that, and they had real power to do so, partially because they had enough funding to, like, pull away from Republican candidates. So, without that threat of leaving and not giving these people your vote, they're not going to listen to you. Like, until you affect them directly. Go ahead.
And for Jayapal being the leader of the Progressive Caucus, she sucks, because really she should have, in light of what both of you are saying, she could have easily taken that energy and, instead of capitulating to you know, her peers, she should have stood firm in what she was saying. No, it's racist. Israel is racist. And you know what? I do not stand for it. And I'm going to, she could say whatever.
Yeah.
And she would have had the backing of at least a few of these members, and basically a lot of people on the left who would have been able to vouch for them and actually make some more noise about it. And now it's gotten to the point now, they've written a resolution now, like I think it was today, regarding, we basically saying, we declare that Israel is not whatever some bullshit it is. So they're really just kind of cleaning up after what she said and playing nice, you know, with the Israel lobby, because they don't want to, my guess is they don't want to affect any donations that
Mama Bear's going to send them to detention, and they're not going to be able to sit at the cool kids table at lunch.
Right. In a matter of speaking, yes. So, you know, but, and it's not just this, they have the power to do it. Take your pick. It could be for Israel-Palestine conflict. It could be in regards to Ukraine. It could be in regards to Medicare for All. It could be in regards to student loan debt. They could do this for any of these things. So it's one thing to kind of verbally say or make a stance on Twitter, I do not stand for this. I do not stand for this right wing. As you said, Joe, it's the idea of them taking action beyond the rhetoric and maybe just like the virtual signaling. How about you do something with that power and having to actually have the backing of people on the left who are working class that will actually vibe with you on these issues. So that's why I say I can't give them that much credit, because it's just a whole lot of virtual signaling in what they're doing right now. At the end of the day, it's just a way to kind of give them the cover that, I disagree with this, but they're not going to do, they've proven that they're not going to do anything with this. And Jemai Paul, as the leader of the Progressive Caucus, really should be leading the charge, but we know how much of a sap she is. So she's not going to go forward in terms of actually, you know, standing on what she said and actually make that declaration and be like, and what are you going to do?
Right. You're going to vote for more war crime funding.
And something that I think, and I just thought of this while I was listening to both of you talk about this. If these right-wing Trump supporters and Republicans who are Make America Great Again and America First were truly about making America first and truly about what happens in the 48 contiguous and Alaska and Hawaii, don't you think they would be against supporting an Israeli regime also? Because don't you think that all of these MAGA Republicans and Trump supporters would look at the funding that is being administered to Israel and say, wait a minute, why are we giving this government $3.8 billion a year or $38 billion every year? How come that money isn't being used in the United States? We're supposed to be making America great again. Why don't we use American taxpayer dollars and keep American taxpayers' dollars in America instead of funding?
You know, it just comes out all wrong. You know, it comes out as
instead of funding.
Go ahead.
No, I was saying instead of funding a defense department in another country. So again, yes, some of them do, but shouldn't there be an overwhelming groundswell of all of these people wearing Make America Great Again hats to say, wait a minute, why are we funding Israel? Right. Why are we using that money here in the United States? Right. Because if they do that, then their racism finds itself with other racists. Racism identifies with other racists. If you look at Europe, there's a reason why the most racist and most imperialist and most wicked leaders in Europe all tend to congregate together. There's a reason why Alexander Lukashenko and Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban have a warm and cozy relationship. There's a reason why. There's also a reason why people like Emmanuel Macron doesn't have a good relationship with the three heads of state that I just mentioned. And even though Emmanuel Macron is just as bad as they are, he's more of a centrist rather than the far rightness of those three people I just mentioned. But again, the inconsistency it remains obvious. If these MAGA Republicans were truly about making America great again and truly about making sure that the United States and its citizenry comes first, they would also be against the continual funding of an Israeli regime. Don't you think?
Yep. You'd think, I mean, you look at, they smear any politician willing to look at Jeremy Corbyn. He was ousted from his own party for saying the same things that we say about Palestine and Israel, pretty much. They use interesting tactics here. They let particular people speak out, and especially when it comes to the right-wing side of things, tends to come out wrong when it comes to Israel arguments from them. Usually they hit that hard J on this one, but they don't talk about things like our police force being trained almost solely by ex-IDF members. Among many problems that we have, as well as all the NATO funding and medical funding that Israel receives.
And they also talk about the digital surveillance that takes place in Israel that the United States consistently adopted.
All these people that get upset at like robots and facial recognition, they have robots at police check stations in Gaza with weapons attached. That's a robot that shoots people.
And take a look at everything that happened with the Pegasus group. I'm sorry, no, it was with the Pegasus software that was implanted on journalists' phones, and that came from an Israeli security firm. I think it was called the NSO group.
Gotcha.
And they were tracking certain journalists' phones. And the NSO group was hired by Mohammed bin Salman, who eventually executed Jamal Khashoggi.
Yep.
That happened. And that was done with Israeli security. And it's the type of mass surveillance that we've seen in the United States over the past, realistically, almost 30 years. But the single piece of legislation that that paved the way for mass surveillance, everyone said it's the Patriot Act, but in fact, it's actually not the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act really didn't the Patriot Act, yes, eventually did
extended it.
Right, but the piece of legislation that gave birth to the Patriot Act is the Counterterrorism Act of 1995. The man responsible for writing and sponsoring the Senate version of the Counterterrorism Act of 1995 is Joe Biden. And the man who wrote and sponsored the House version of that same bill is Chuck Schumer. And you all can go ahead and look this up and fact check me. But this is what happened. So I don't know why anybody is surprised that a man who essentially wrote the Patriot Act, which is the reason why the United States has hyper surveillance in the United States, is going to go ahead and kowtow to an Israeli right-wing hyper surveillance regime. I don't see why this is a surprise to anyone.
Yep.
And I also don't see why this is a surprise that the one senator that has written more racist legislation over the past 40 years than any other politician in the United States will willingly go ahead and support an Israeli regime, a right-wing racist, genocidal, racist regime. That's what's happening. So why is anybody surprised? Why is anybody shocked by this?
And you ain't black.
Yep.
I guess I'm not black enough for Joe Biden. I guess I'm not black enough for Joe Biden. But I know what I'm not doing in 2024 is voting for Joe Biden. Moreover, I'm not voting Democrat. Let's put it that way.
How dare you? Don't you care about democracy? Do you want Trump to win? Find out more.
I mean, look, and I know we're talking, I know this is somewhat off topic, but And I know you're saying, "Hey, don't you want Trump to win?" there are again, 3.5, 4 years ago when Biden announced his candidacy for the president of the United States, I was screaming at the top of my lungs, "No, not him." Because everybody remembered that he wrote the crime bill. A few other people were willing to dig a little deeper, remembered that he wrote the crack bill. But if people really look at all of the stuff that he did, let's not forget, Joe Biden is the reason why Clarence Thomas is Supreme Court Justice.
Right.
And his appointment of Clarence Thomas paved the way for Brett Kavanaugh to be a current Supreme Court Justice.
Yep.
But nobody's talking about this. No one will talk about this. No one will talk about the fact that Joe Biden's mentor was Strom Thurmond, a segregationist, who in 1948 decided to run for president as a third-party candidate. And his third party, the Dixiecrat Party, was an offshoot of the Democratic Party of the United States, not the Republican Party. Here's what makes it worse. 1948, he ran as a third-party candidate, had over 1 million votes, and won 4 states. And that same guy, Strom Thurmond, is the same guy that Joe Biden was mentored Joe Biden. And if you remember about the crime bill that happened in 1994, everyone thinks that the crime bill happened in 1994 was just written once. No, there were 3 versions of the crime bill. The first one was written in May of 1991. All written and sponsored by Joe Biden. The first one was May of 1991. It didn't go anywhere. So the second one was written, it was called the Biden-Thurmond Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1991. It was in November of 1991. It passed in the Senate. House Republicans filibustered because it wasn't tough enough on crime. Again, House Republicans, I'm sorry, I think it was House Democrats filibustered it because it wasn't tough enough on crime. 1992, Bill Clinton gets elected. And again, I'm old enough to remember this. I was 16 years old. I was a sophomore in high school at the time. The only discernible difference between Bill Clinton and George Bush, and let's not forget who George Bush was. George Bush was incumbent president. He was vice president for Ronald Reagan for 8 years. And before that, he was head of the Central Intelligence Agency. So given everything we know about George Bush, the first George Bush, he looked at 3 strikes, you're out, and said, yo, that's a bit too extreme for me. And Bill Clinton said, yep, I'll do 3 strikes, you're out. That's the only reason he got elected.
Those blue dog Democrats.
Right.
Was that little
Joe
group,
Biden
right?
ran. Yeah. So again, getting back to everything we're talking about regarding Israel and Palestine, we've seen that the far right wing of the Israeli government is racist. They commit acts of atrocity. They commit war crimes. They commit crimes against humanity. By the way, tear gas is a war crime, as prescribed by the Geneva Convention of 1925. It's a war crime. If tear gas is a war crime against Palestinians, don't you think tear gas should be a war crime against Black people that suffered tear gas injuries in the summer of 2020 and summer of 2021? Why? And again, we're talking about solidarity. We're talking about, in the words of Bob Marley, an exodus, a movement of the people. Why was there not a group of lawyers and attorneys and legal scholars that were willing to file human rights violations and human rights claims against the police departments of the United States in the summer of 2020 and summer of 2021? Why is the squad not willing to go ahead and do this against the United Nations for every single Black person that was killed at the hands of a racist white cop? Again, we don't need everybody. We just need a few. And quite honestly, we only need one. Because once one does it, everyone else will start to look and say, wow, these police in the United States are really doing some shit against Black people. And they're committing human rights violations. They're committing not only war crimes, but crimes against humanity. And again, this is no different than what is happening to Palestinians right now. No different. The only difference is Black people are speaking English, the Palestinians are speaking Arabic. But if you look at the physical geography of what is happening to Palestinians live in an open air prison. impoverished Black people live in housing projects, which might as well be open air prisons.
Which also,
There's really not that much difference.
Just to add in,
And
this guy.
And real quick,
Go ahead.
Real quick, Reek, before I, the lawyer earlier on in Democracy Now! Talked about the poisoning of water in Palestine. In Palestine, how is that any different than the poisoning of water with lead in the water in various cities where there's a high concentration of Black people in the United States?
Yeah.
We talked about Palestine in the Middle East. What about East Palestine in Ohio? What about that and the water that's being poisoned there? What about the lead in the water in Flint, Michigan? How is this any different? Why are people not seeing the parallels and the struggles for Palestinian liberation and the liberation of Black people and low-wage earning white people and brown people in America? Why are people not seeing the parallels? Why are people not doing the mental math? Why are people not seeing the obvious intersectionality between both groups?
I'm against propaganda and gaslighting and poor education.
What about the poor people in Jackson, Mississippi?
Yeah.
What about Jackson, Mississippi? What about Jackson, Mississippi? They didn't have
so
water.
many.
They didn't
Those
have
are the only ones we know about.
Months.
Like, you know what I mean? I'm sure Detroit's water is just fine. I'm sure Chicago's doing great. Like, but
when we talked about the Palestinian government, the Israeli government taking land from the Palestinians. Again, later on, we were going to talk about the last remaining survivor of the Black Wall Street massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and her not getting reparations. Take a look at what happened with Black Wall Street. It was a group of angry white Republicans, right-wing racists that massacred Black people and took their land.
Right.
How is that any different than what is happening in Palestine right now? How is that any different?
It's not.
The only difference is that people in Palestine aren't Black. But and I don't want anybody to think that I'm being crazy, but quite frankly, the Palestinians are the Black people of the Middle East.
Yeah.
If you really think about it on a socioeconomic paradigm or framework, the Palestinians in Palestine are the Black are obviously there's obvious comparison to the Black people in the United States. It's obvious. And the sooner that people see that, the sooner I think people can make changes, not only socially, not only at a grassroots level, but on a political level.
Well, here's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Biden admin extends U.S. habit of interfering in other countries' domestic policies. Now it's threatening Israel with the ending of special relationship between our two nations. As president, my support of Israel will be unconditional. So just tell me you're bought by the AIPAC lobby. More words. But see Jesse Jett putting his 2 cents in. Good for you, Jesse. But yeah, I'm Collin, anything to close us out with this?
Real quick, before you jump in, Collin, I want to make sure I'm crystal clear with what I'm saying. This is not me ranting against Israeli people. This is not me ranting against Jewish people. This is not what this is about. It's not what this is about. I want to make sure I'm clarifying this.
Right.
It's about a right-wing Israeli government that continues to persecute Palestinians. That's what this is about. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. Racism is a function of economics. But this is also why I'm a strong proponent of reparations. And if you really draw more parallels to this, there's not that much difference, or at least the ethos of reparations is really not that much different than boycott, divest, and sanction. If you really think about it, because when we talk about boycott, divest, and sanction, it's to make sure that human rights violations are ending against an oppressed group of people. And the way you do that is to hurt somebody's pockets economically. You hurt their economic positioning. You hurt their economic positioning. If you think about reparations, reparations are a way to repair the harm that has been done by a power structure over decades and or generations. And again, we talked about this from Dr. Sandy Darity's book, From Here to Equality. There are two, it talks about a framework called acknowledgement, redress, closure. There are two paths for redress. The one path is atonement, the other path is restitution. It's inappropriate to ask for atonement because atonement involves forgiveness, and everybody that was around from slavery is dead. So you can't ask a dead person for forgiveness. The only other way to go about redress is through a path of restitution, which is a legal framework for indemnification. It's the only way to go about it. And indemnification involves making somebody whole. The best way to make somebody whole, and from a financial standpoint, is money, is cash, is resources. So when you think about boycott, divest, sanction, it's an economic framework. When you think about reparations, it's primarily rooted in economics. Racism is the foundation, the unfortunate foundation that is the problem for both of these situations, for not only the situation in Palestine, but for Black people, indigenous people, and people of color, people in the Caribbean diaspora, etc.
Yep. Collin?
I have nothing more to add.
Yep. I feel you. We could do this for 3 more hours on that one subject, but